Us on this lovely afternoon, kind of sunny fall afternoon here on the West Coast in California. Hope we're having good weather all over the country. Welcome to another special installment of Conversations with Authors. And thank you for supporting today's event and also any and all book passage events that you join in. We really appreciate the virtual support as well as the now in-person events. I don't know if you knew it, but we have started combining our virtual events with some in-store events in San Francisco and Corte Madera, safely gathering. Feel free to check out our website for a schedule of which events are in-store and which events are virtual and online. But thank you for supporting in whatever way you do. And of course, supporting the authors by purchasing their books before, during, or after each event. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. Among other things, I coordinate events for social justice for Book Passage. And the things that make today's discussion very special is it is the intersection of social justice and sports. In 2016, amid an epidemic of police shootings of African Americans, the celebrated NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick began a series of quiet protests on the field, refusing to stand during the U.S. national anthem. By taking a knee, Kaepernick bravely joined a long tradition of American athletes making powerful political statements. This time, however, Kaepernick's simple act spread like wildfire through American society, becoming the symbol of resistance to America's persistent racial inequality. Critically acclaimed sports journalist Dave Zirin chronicles all of this in The Kaepernick Effect through interviews with professional athletes across different sports, college and high school athletes, athletic directors, and coaches. In each case, he uncovers the fascinating explanation and motivations behind a mass political movement in sports through deeply personal and inspiring accounts of activism. Dave Zirin is the sports editor of The Nation, a columnist for The Progressive, and the host of the Edge of Sports podcast. His many books include A People's History of Sports in the United States, Game Over, and Bad Sports. Zirin has also been a regular guest on MSNBC, CNN, and ESPN. He joins us from the Washington, D.C. area. Dave, thank you so much.
Oh, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to do a little intro about this book I wrote, The Kaepernick Effect, and then we're going to be in some conversation about it. If you have any questions, throw them in there. I thought that intro was terrific because it established what I think needs to be established to even have this conversation about the effect of Colin Kaepernick, and that's that there's a rich history in this country of athletes using their hyper-exalted, brought to you by Nike platform to actually say something about the world. I mean, any honest reckoning with the civil rights movement also includes a chapter about Jackie Robinson and the breaking of the NFL color line. Or any article about the 1960s should include sections about Muhammad Ali or Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who raised their fists on the medal stand in Mexico City in 1968. Or if you're going to write about the women's liberation struggles of the 1970s, there needs to be space for Billie Jean King. And of course, just as Jackie Robinson and the civil rights movement, it is impossible to imagine this recent period, the Black Lives Matter movement, without the image of Colin Kaepernick first sitting and then taking that fateful knee. Now, why did Kaepernick have a particular resonance, especially because he certainly wasn't the first athlete to protest, particularly athletes in the WNBA had also protested. I mean, the first and most obvious reason is that there was a movement in the streets willing to support and connect with him. I mean, Colin Kaepernick first sat during the anthem in the summer of 2016, August, in a preseason game, and he did it right on the heels of videos that were released of the police killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. So he was connected with something that was happening outside the field. But it's more than that, honestly. The National Football League is the closest thing to a national religion that we have in this country, and he's the quarterback. So the most recognizable person on one of the most recognizable teams, the San Francisco 49ers, playing in a league which is really the closest thing to a monoculture that we have in this country. I mean, if you look at the top 20 rated TV shows of the last several years, 19 of them are NFL games. In our sliced and diced entertainment culture, the power of this league only grows more consolidated. But another reason why Colin Kaepernick had resonance was doing it in that space during the anthem. I mean, by doing so, he was implicit, even though he was taking a knee against police violence and racial inequity, he was also taking on the hyper-patriotism of the National Football League and turning it on its head. And what he was doing was actually saying that there is a gap between what we say this country stands for and the actual lived experiences of far too many people. Now, the other thing that Colin Kaepernick was doing, and why I think it had such an electric effect on others, is that he was thumbing his nose at the labor and racial discipline that's a prerequisite for the NFL's very existence. I mean, this is an authoritarian league that was upturned by Colin Kaepernick because he was also exposing the contradiction between those who play and those who get paid for them playing. In other words, the difference between the profits in the owner's box and the player who lives on an unguaranteed contract and plays only 3.5 years. But the lasting power of Kaepernick's gesture is that it allowed for replication, and that's what my book's really about, the replication of that gesture. I mean, the way people use that gesture of taking a knee during the anthem as a kind of language, as a method for struggle that they could adopt. I interviewed like dozens of young athletes from all over the country who took a knee, and what I learned was truly fascinating. I mean, I learned, first of all, that these young athletes didn't just do it because Colin Kaepernick did it. They were not copycats following a trend. They did it because there had been police violence in their own communities, or in some cases in their own families. They did it because we've never had a generation in this country, a young generation, that's more diverse and less tolerant of intolerance. They are determined to write their own narrative, and that's very thrilling, and I'm looking for ways to support that. As for the athletes of this generation, in Kaepernick, they saw someone who provided this kind of language for them to practice the art of dissent. And Kaepernick also demonstrated for these young people that the space of the athletic field was a space that could be claimed for a community protest. People in the stands taking a knee or applauding the athletes themselves, or people booing. I mean, in our hollowed out cities and small towns where there's a war against public space, the athletic field is really one of those last community gathering points. And nature abhors a vacuum. So if there's something in your society that you're upset about, it actually makes sense that it would funnel through a football program, when in previous decades, I mean, I'm sure people have this experience, you wouldn't exactly look to the football program as a center of protest. But people also were affected so much by Kaepernick, not because of Colin Kaepernick, but because of the generational trauma that they've experienced in this era of racial killings, particularly ones caught on camera. And what I found was particularly interesting is that more than Colin Kaepernick's name, I heard the name Trayvon Martin from folks who, of course, the young teen who was murdered by George Zimmerman in 2012. For a lot of, if you're 19 years old, think about it, that means you were 10 when Trayvon Martin was killed. And for a lot of these folks, that's what they grew up with. They grew up young enough to wonder why the world had to be this way, but old enough to follow the case. And it really did cause a generational trauma, which I certainly did not realize was a formative part of this generation's existence, but it clearly was. Now, I would just end by saying my reason for wanting to collect all these narratives is because I really don't like the way we tell history in this country. I mean, we tell it as if it's the story of great people, usually great men, who are the ones who are the great movers of history, and the rest of us are passive observers in this process of making history, when the reality is that it's really the opposite that's true. It's masses of people that make history, people whose names we don't even know, and these great leaders that we all read about in our history books actually emerge from that mass. And in this particular case, I didn't want people to look back on this era and think it was all about this one quarterback who took a knee. As impressive as I believe Colin Kaepernick's demonstrations were, it's about the people he affected. And when you have a situation that hundreds, if not thousands, of young athletes take a knee in this country between 2016 and 2020, and when you have a situation in the summer of 2020 after the police murder of George Floyd, which triggers the largest number of protests in the history of the United States, with the most number of people in the history of the United States over the course of that summer, then it became really clear to me that one of the roads that led to the summer of 2020 was paved through the athletic fields of the United States. And that's all I got to say about that.
That's a lot, though, Dave.
Yeah.
And I got to say, I think this is a good time to interject that if you're watching this or later on watching it at some point, the book is not so much about sports. So if you're not into football or whatever, this book is about activism and people, especially young people, being inspired by an athlete. So I see it more as definitely the intersection of sports and social activism, but it's really more these vignettes of these people, young, some, middle-aged, whatever, that are just impacted by something that an athlete, Colin Kaepernick, created. And you point out about how football in so many ways, or specifically the NFL, is such a thread, a fabric of our society. And I'm wondering, were you surprised that when Colin did this and then subsequently other athletes and people did this, the negative response it got? Because it's not like, as you pointed out, it's not the first time this has been done, that there's been political activism around sports or taking that platform. But yet, we can get into more, some of your stories of just the horrendous kind of rejection a lot of, like, some of the high school students received.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering, were you surprised by the response?
Well, it was pointed out to me by someone who read the book, and I didn't even realize it as I was putting it together, that one of the things that binds all the stories is this threat of violence, or the reality of actual violence, that hits all of these young people who are engaging in an act of nonviolent civil disobedience as a way to spark discussion about racism and police brutality. And so I'm not surprised that the response was so incredibly divided and harsh, because they would get some support and then other people would be thinking about violence. But I do believe that in all these experiences from the last 5 years, a lot of these athletes were really the canary in the coal mine for a lot of these debates around so-called critical race theory, where you have white parents losing their minds at the thought of their kids learning about the realities of the transatlantic slave trade, or the dispossession of land from indigenous peoples. Like, they view the teaching of truth as a threat to their place in society. And I think that seeing these young athletes, many of them young black and brown athletes, take a knee during the anthem, they saw it as more than just a call for discussion. They saw it as a threat to the idea that this country is fundamentally moral, because that's what the protest is really saying. It's about the gap. It's about the gap between what we're told the anthem represents and their lived experiences. And that is something that, particularly football fans, did not want to hear, especially from athletes who I think a lot of football fans look down upon. I mean, they love being entertained by them, but at the end of the day, there's a patronizing that takes place about them being dumb or ill-informed. I mean, certainly that's very racialized in how they view many athletes. And then feeling a sense of offense that they're being forced to think about things that they'd rather not think about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was with football. I think it was one of a basketball player where LeBron James, where someone said, "Shut up and play ball." Like, just kind of this attitude of it brings out what they're really thinking. Like you said, you're for our entertainment, but we really don't respect you, or we only respect you as you're winning or you're within a certain arena that we expect you to stay in, and you step out of that, they have a problem with it. And it speaks to also that a lot of America, especially white and racist, are used to us hiding the truth of racism. And they don't want it brought out now, even though now's the time we want to claim history. And I think it's important to stress that kids like one of the ones you depict, Rodney Axon, I think from
Yeah.
Ohio, um, because a lot of people felt initially, well, they're just doing this either to show support for Kaepernick or to get on some social bandwagon. But actually, it was more for their own personal reasons. And I thought that was so admirable that high school students really wanted an opportunity to express how they felt about racism in society, but also racism directed at them personally.
Mm-hmm.
And what was it? Isaiah Pollack
Pollard.
of
Yeah.
Detroit's Denby High School.
Yeah.
Shout out to Detroit. I'm from Detroit originally.
Uh,
He's quoted in the book as saying, "We did so because of the injustices around our city and around America."
mm-hmm.
I thought, wow, that's so
Mm-hmm.
profound from such a young person. I was just like, that's amazing. But it spoke to really kind of refuting this idea of they're just trying to get on video. They're just trying to get some social attention, social media attention. And that wasn't it at all.
I started writing this book as someone feeling very pessimistic about the state of the world in its present and the state of the world in its future. I started writing it at the very beginning of the pandemic, which only seemed to compound the regular ills that we deal with, from fear of an environmental
Yep.
degradation to police violence, of course, to rampant inequality, all of these issues. And talking to these young people actually turned me into an optimist just over the course of working on this book, because it's really their world more than it is mine. I mean, they're the ones who are 17, 18 years old who are going to have to grow up and grow old in this society, and their tenacity about not settling for the kind of world that maybe other generations were willing to settle for. Like I said in the talk, I think this generation, well, statistically, it just is more demographically diverse than any generation in history. But I also think they're less tolerant of intolerance than any generation ever. That's why so much effort is being taken to silence them. I mean, what is the demagoguery around so-called cancel culture if it's not a way to actually quiet people from speaking out against people who are willing to, be racist, sexist, and homophobic? I mean, it's trying to silence people who are making an effort to fight for a more just world, not just a tolerant world, but a world of accepted justice. And that is seen as a tremendous threat. But just speaking to their tenacity of it, I mean, the calluses that some of these folks have from the experience. Like someone else asked me this, like asking if they left pessimistic from taking part in these kinds of protests, and what they all had no regrets though. I mean, even if it ended badly, even if it ended with them having to leave their school, even if it left with them with not feeling like their family is safe because of death threats, they all feel this tremendous sense of pride that they were part of something bigger than themselves. And that's why I wanted to put it in a book like this that had a bunch of the stories together told in their words, is because I also wanted them to, it's not just about how the world sees them, but it's also how I want them to see themselves. That you weren't just this one-off case in this small town in Storm Lake, Iowa, that you were part of something significant, an actual movement in this country that never really got reported upon like it should have been, precisely because it's the sports page and it's football and it was during Trump, and nobody wanted to touch this idea that maybe these kids were doing something significant that demanded attention.
Absolutely, and I think the high school students and college students that you chronicle, I kind of thought in terms of the shooting, and I'm going kind of blank on the shooting where it was the young students, the high schoolers, that really took the issue of gun violence to
Yeah.
Congress. And that combined with these stories, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. I should know that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Parkland.
we actually have so many shootings; it's hard sometimes to
Yeah.
remember. But in Florida, it was in Florida. But I'm so inspired by the students that you chronicled, and then when I thought about these students that really took up the case to Congress about gun control because of the violence, inflicted on them,
Yeah.
and you're right. It is for us that are older. It can be kind of you can kind of develop a pessimistic attitude and a hopelessness. But I'm constantly inspired by these young activists in a way. And as you said, there were some who almost everyone that you talked to said they didn't regret it. They would do it again. And some even said that it really inspired them to really pursue um, more activity like this
Hmm.
and be more of an inspiration to others. And I thought that that's amazing, and I'm glad you chronicled it. I also learned things. I didn't think I would learn anything new, but when you talk to April in Beaumont, Texas, and she used the term that they live like maybe an hour, 30 minutes or an hour from an area where it's a sundown town.
Sundown Town.
I was like, are you kidding me? That's still going on?
Yeah.
That was just in itself was amazing. And to be that close to where there's a community that still has that going on, but to show activism and support your community like that in the face of that is amazing.
Yeah. And April Parkerson of Beaumont, Texas. What a story from Beaumont. I mean,
Yeah.
when you have middle schoolers who take a knee, and this is what's so wild. Texas, not only their football league cancels itself, like they just cancel the entire league, cancel the kids' team. And this is a remarkable thing to me because, people joke in Texas that, the old joke is that it goes Texas, God, and football. No, it's God, football, and family, and not necessarily in that order, because they love their football in Texas. And I guess they love white supremacy more because they make the decision to actually stop a league from playing football precisely because these kids are taking a knee. And then the kids would have not had a team except some NFL players donated money for them to get equipment and start a new team. And the team is much more serious about education and making sure kids' grades are up. And they've turned it into this kind of beautiful thing. But it started in such an ugly matter about an ugly manner. Like it reminded me a little bit. I was in Brazil before the World Cup doing some reporting for this book I did, and people were marching on the stadiums in Brazil because they were so angry about all the public funding that had gone to build them for the World Cup. And I remember somebody around me saying, like, boy, you really have to screw up politically in Brazil if you have people protesting soccer. That's like people in New York
Right.
protesting pizza.
Yeah.
And in this case, like having Texas officials shut down football because they're so wedded to this idea that these kids needed to know their place is just, it's a staggering statement. And again, I think it's a canary in the coal mine for a lot of the stuff you see coming out of Texas these days.
Oh, absolutely. And obviously, we want to keep the spotlight on these young activists, these athletes, and the one you were talking about, April and Beaumont. Yeah, they wiped out their whole uh, program
Yeah.
over it. It was just and the parents and the kids didn't even see this coming. They had no idea that it would go that far. They thought maybe there'll be a little bit of pushback, but to that extreme.
Never saw it coming. I mean, and I
Have you
think
ever
that's
heard
true
of
for a
anything?
lot of the folks. That's another common thread in the book. There's that old expression about, you don't need a missile launcher to kill a butterfly. It's like all these little butterflies trying to spread their wings and fly and protest and make themselves heard, which should be relished as something in the best American tradition. And the response by people is not even a fly swatter, but a missile launcher. Like it's like we want, like we talked about before about violence being this common thread. It's just like the Beaumont story is an example of just the way they want to eradicate people who wanted to use the football field to raise the issue of police violence. And I think the problem was the mere fact that they were raising the issue. I mean, doing it on the football field was upsetting for them because, that's football. That's where we're there to cheer you. And we don't want to be lectured to about politics. And, of course, they have no problem with, salute to the troops and, the Star Spangled Banner, which is a politically deeply problematic song. Like they have no problem with any of that. But once you start talking about police violence, well, now you're taking it too far. And now you're putting politics in sports. And for these young people to do it anyway. I mean, even with all of those restrictions on how they felt like they could speak and express themselves, I mean, it's amazing. It's like a thousand flowers blooming. Like that's the part I didn't want people to forget. Is like from Kaepernick, a thousand flowers did bloom, and they bloomed with this idea that they could build something better in this country. And people were like, we don't want to hear that, but they're tough. So it's like someone asked me if these young people, if going through this experience made them be like, did it like make them say, oh, hell with America, because people are so mean to me. And I said, you know what, talking to them, oh, they were so mean to them. Yeah. And I said that talking to them, it's not even so much about proud to be an American. That never really entered the conversation. It was more about they're proud to be human beings and proud to be alive and wanting and proud to be building a better world. And if people come against them, that's just the price for trying to move this country forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, as your book is focused on the reaction to Kaepernick, and I mostly want to keep it there for our talk, but I do have some specific questions, if you don't mind, about Kaepernick himself and the NFL's reaction. Do you feel that the NFL's reaction initially and since was completely unwarranted? And were you surprised that it went on as long as it has? And I mean, he's not on a team to this day.
Yeah. Yes, completely unwarranted. No, I'm not surprised. I mean, because they determined that there's no doubt that they colluded against Colin Kaepernick. They settled with him out of court on his collusion case, handed him a big check so he wouldn't, get talk about it anymore and get discovery on emails. Because as they're learning, the last thing the NFL wants is the public to read their emails. That's a big story in the news today of a coach who was fired because all this racist, sexist, and homophobic garbage was found on his email server when there was an investigation being done about a sexual harassment really circle on a team, the team in Washington near where I live. So they settled out of court. Colin Kaepernick.
John Gruden?
Yes.
Okay.
And they made the decision that Colin Kaepernick had more value to them as a ghost story by which they could threaten young players and say, you better not, step out of line or you can end up like Colin Kaepernick and kicked out of this league. And am I surprised they did it? I'm not, because Colin Kaepernick threatened something very fundamental to the existence of the NFL. And that's that the whole league is built on this racial and labor discipline that requires players to accept the fact that they're 70% black. They only play for 3.5 years. They don't have guaranteed contracts. They have to live with that reality while almost entirely white ownership groups make billions and billions of dollars. So for them to accept that state of affairs, everybody needs to stay in line, and a very authoritarian structure needs to be operational. And just by stepping out of that line and saying, well, I want to say something about police violence, and I'm going to do it during the anthem, and I'm doing it without anybody's sanction or approval, that in and of itself, I think, is seen as very threatening by the National Football League, like the equivalent of being worried that Colin Kaepernick is actually just pulling a string on a very expensive sweater. And eventually it could all unravel if this becomes the open talking point, a league that will not hire black executives, but will sacrifice black bodies.
Wow. Yeah. When you put it like that, for sure. And do you feel like, where does Colin fit now? I mean, because now it's been about 4 or 5 years. Well, first of all, I'd like to know, has he been in touch with any of the students in particular that you highlight? But I've just been so curious because he's really been quiet. And not in a bad way. I'm not being critical of Colin. I'm just saying I thought like he'd be able to take kind of like a larger platform as an activist.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I don't know if you've had conversations with him, does he see himself moving on, since he's obviously not going to be, brought back on by the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, he's got a very busy couple of months planned because he's going to unveil this special that he's doing on Netflix with Ava DuVernay, who of course did Selma and other films. And it's meant to sort of introduce him and his politics to the world. It's called Colin Kaepernick in Black and White. And it'll be interesting to see if there's a public appetite for his sort of autobiographical treatise about himself. That'll be very interesting to see. He's also got a children's book coming out. He has a book about prison abolition that he edited that just came out this week. So I think we're seeing a bit of a rollout of him after years of silence, introducing himself to the public. And I have no idea how that's going to go. But I do know this. The effect that he had won't be lost on these young folks, and the effect that they had on their communities won't be lost. And because of that, I actually never minded his choice of silence for these last few years, because obviously, if I had a choice and a magic wand, I would have him doing a series of mass meetings in cities around the country, and selling and packing churches, which he surely has the capacity to do. But he'd be up there with other local activists and speakers, and that would be amazing. But the benefit of the silence, which I don't want to get lost, is that it allowed the gesture to be replicated in a way that was almost pure. Like, what if Colin Kaepernick held political, and I don't really want to give examples, but what if he held political positions that we generally would find noxious, for example? Then all of a sudden, taking a knee isn't just about fighting racial inequity. Now you're also kind of representing the fact that Colin Kaepernick thinks that the sun actually revolves around the earth or something like that. Like, who knows? And I'm not saying he holds any beliefs like that, but you then become bound to have to defend things you don't necessarily are there to defend. And so I like that there's been the purity of it's able to be used as a symbol and as a language. And I wonder if these specials in books that he's going to be rolling out, I wonder if they're going to have the capacity to further burnish that language, or if it would be something that then does make people think, okay, this is more about him than me. It'll be interesting to see what happens culturally to the gesture, because I think that knee thing is really powerful. And that's something I've been talking to a lot of folks about. Like, what is it about this knee? Just taking a knee that sends, school administrative officials and boosters into this state of panic. Like, this gesture, so defiant during the anthem, so ubiquitous in so many cities and towns around the country. and also so universal. Like if you and I took a knee during the anthem at a state fair, no one would think that I lost a contact lens. They would know exactly why we were doing it, and it would be that identifiable.
That's a good point. Yeah. Um, and I agree with you. Your take on Colin going quiet for all these years. I thought the first thought I had was it kind of proved, not that I ever personally doubted that he was being authentic, but I think it really sealed that it was authentic, that he wasn't trying to become something else. He wasn't trying to become a celebrity of social media. So I felt like it was kind of like a way of him saying that, I'm not trying to profit off of it. I was doing it for specific reasons. But I think it's fine that now, like you say, he is going to have a rollout of certain things. And I'm looking forward to it. Like, I
And it's
can't wait.
also, and it's also like he's still only, I believe 33 years
Yeah,
old. I mean, 34 years old. It's like, what's he supposed to do? I mean, he's
right.
Colin Kaepernick, and they're not letting him play football or be part of the NFL or coach or anything like that. So it's like, okay, make a special with Ava DuVernay, sell it to Netflix. I mean, what else is he supposed to do? But it's precisely because of him not trying to do some big profit grab off the gesture that I'm giving my proceeds from the book to an organization called Serve Your City DC that does mutual aid with youth. And so folks out there, when you buy the book, you're actually not just supporting this amazing bookstore, you're also supporting an organization called Serve Your City. And that was very important to me, because it's like these young people who took a knee, they didn't do it for social media fame, they didn't do it for profit, they did it out of principle. And so it seemed like me profiting off their principle wasn't really in the spirit of the book. So paying it forward it's been a good experience.
Oh, great. I'm glad you said that because I was not aware of that, or I had forgotten. And I think it's such an important point. And the book is out now, launched about a couple weeks ago, and we have plenty of them at Book Passage, both locations. So definitely support the book, which supports a good cause, and is a really good, quick, easy read. And I mean that as a compliment. I went into it thinking, oh, I don't really know much about football. Am I going to be able to navigate this? And it reminded me a little bit of like reading the vignettes of Brian Stevenson,
Mm, of
the lawyer. And
course.
it was like, oh yeah, I want to hear about this person in this case. And I felt it had a similar feel to me. So
Thank you so much.
yeah, he's amazing. And
Yeah.
this in that league for sure. Where do you see activism and sports going from here? Do you think this is something that is going to kind of a pace that we're going to keep up with? Or do you think, as it has before, where it kind of went into hiding, so to speak, or was shut up, maybe successfully shut up, then kind of came back thanks to Colin Kaepernick and then Black Lives Matter movement and the death or the murder of George Floyd? Do you see it kind of having these plateaus and then going back, or maybe a consistent run
Yeah, I
because of the
think
young?
we're talking ebb and flow for sure.
Uh,
But the big difference between now and say the 90s is that the wine is out of the bottle at this point, and social media is right at an athlete's fingertips. And
yeah,
so, we should expect them to make political interventions in the world. And, my take on it has always been, you don't have to agree with everything people say. I mean, and if you don't agree, you should speak back, but we can't have a society, let alone a sports world, where people feel like they've signed away their right to have a political opinion just because they signed a pro contract. And
yeah,
so, that doesn't mean we have to clap our hands every time an athlete says something political. I mean, especially if we disagree, and you're seeing this now with a lot of disagreements in the athletic world around the question of vaccines. And, and a lot of athletes have said things that I fundamentally disagree with. Um, but you respond to those disagreements respectfully. You don't say, shut up and dribble now that you're saying something that I don't agree with. It's like, so that there's a principle there. And I think in the future, yeah, athletes are going to be part of whatever national conversation is going on. Because they don't play in a vacuum, they don't play in a hermetically sealed bubble, they don't play on a spaceship orbiting the Earth yet.
Yeah.
So
Well,
so
yeah, and I
they're
think
part of the world.
I think it's interesting how a lot of things are coming out now with athletes about mental health.
Yes.
Um, uh, Naomi Osaka, um, and thank God, because I just watched something about Malice at the Palace,
Yes.
and I realized that the athlete at the center of that, when you're hearing it now, all these years later, that, oh my gosh, there was mental health issues going on that nobody wanted, even um, his colleagues, that they just kind of were like, yeah, we knew something was going on, but we just let him deal with it quietly. And how much this has to be replicated across sports.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's the mental health thing in sports is now part of a larger conversation that should be coming out.
And that's very important, especially in men's sports, because we're trying to fight toxic masculinity in this world. We're trying to fight the idea that seeking mental wellness or needing to seek mental wellness is not some sort of act of weakness, but it's actually an act of strength to try to reach out and get help. And more and more athletes are heeding that call. And that's a huge difference from even 10 years ago. And it has, I think, a really strong ripple effect in the broader society. I mean, actions like that, when they're open about it, it makes people feel less alone, and it could even save lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we go, I want to get in a couple questions from the audience. We have a good showing today, Dave.
Oh,
You drew
lovely.
in a good crowd, and
Hi, everybody.
yeah. And I want to remind people you can put questions in the chat. You can put questions and comments, and we will bring those up if we have enough time. Ariel Smythe asked, do you think commercially packaged stories like The Blind Side are helpful for raising awareness, or do you think not?
Wow. I mean, that's a question. I think anytime you have something, The Blind Side's maybe not the best example, but I think of something like 42, the movie about Jackie Robinson, starring late Chadwick Boseman. There are parts of that movie, as someone who treasures that history myself. There were parts I disagreed with. I disagreed with some of the choices they made. I did think it was way too slickly packaged. But at the same time, it provides an opening for a conversation. And all of a sudden, you can actually engage with people who've seen the movie about, well, who is the real Jackie Robinson? Or I should say, who's the Jackie Robinson that I feel like I know based on the readings that I've done, and how does it differ from the film? Those are very rich conversations, and ones I don't think we should step away from. So, like the commercially packed sports stuff, a lot of it is very flawed. But if we go into it as critical readers and critical thinkers, we can really use them to our advantage.
Yeah, I think when you get, I could be wrong, but I think with The Blind Side, I assuming she's talking about the movie that came out with Sandra Bullock. I think sometimes what we have a problem with is it comes across as the white savior.
Oh
It,
yeah, that one. I've never
yeah,
seen The
very.
Blind.
I know. I've only seen clips because
Oh, okay.
immediately that's what I think of. Like, I'm sure maybe she was very well-meaning family, but you're putting the emphasis on the white family that helped them. That tends to be problematic.
I
Um,
mean, Different Strokes was on like 40 years ago. We got to move beyond it.
right, right. And I like when you bring out like Chadwick Boseman's, because that's something a lot of people just didn't have enough information about Jackie Robinson, and certainly a younger generation. And it was a great way to reach that generation with information about an icon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm like, I guess what I'm saying is we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to some of these films. But white savior sports films are the pits. So that gets a big thumbs down.
Politically too. Yeah, I think we had a few of those with South African apartheid. It's like, yeah.
Bull.
What was that movie? I can't remember the
Cry
movie.
freedom.
No, not Cry Freedom. It was The Power of One. And the
Oh,
one was a little white kid. It was like, are you kidding me? Like,
I remember the power of one.
you remember that? I know.
Yeah.
We do have
Stephen Dorff.
another,
Stephen
another
Dorff was the little blonde kid.
right, right. We have a question from or a comment. Question, any comment on Andrew Wiggins and vaccinations and how the Warriors as a team handled this so respectfully?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with the sort of direction that the question takes us in. In that, I thought the Golden State Warriors handled a difficult situation very well. We got to get the players vaccinated. I mean, we need to do it for the same reason we need to get the public vaccinated. And we should also remember, as we talk about NBA players and vaccinations, that the rate in the NBA is currently about 95%. And there's a media issue where the 5% gets amplified when, that's a higher percentage than a lot of frontline workers in this country. And it's important that we understand that when these players, a lot of them are mistrustful of vaccinations because they don't trust this country. I mean, and that's a bigger problem, is that we don't have faith in institutions anymore. Like, we always think that there's some nefarious three-dimensional chess match happening behind the scenes between Bill Gates and Dick Cheney, when sometimes there's just a massive public health crisis
Right.
that requires a vaccine.
Right.
For the workings of the entire system. And so that message, really needed to get communicated. And I thought the Warriors did a really good job. I really did.
Yeah.
I didn't agree with Draymond's press conference thing. I thought that was really wrong. But where he talked about, he defended not getting vaccines, and I think there's a way to make the argument without pushing people away. I think that's far more important.
Yeah, yeah. My thing is just, can we get past this, get to the other side of COVID?
Yeah,
Do this
this is
as a
about,
society, quit seeing
yeah,
it as a personal crusade and just see it as the we and not me.
common good. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, that's the problem, is we have no, we can rightly, be harsh on the folks not getting vaccinated, but it's like we have no culture of public health in this country. We have very little culture of public solidarity. It's why other countries did a lot better than the United States when this broke out. And we need to address that problem, certainly, in addition to getting everybody vaccinated.
Good point. Yeah, and especially when you think about when all this rolled out, it was, when we were, we were still dealing with an administration, a president that had us polarized already. And then we were in transition with a new administration, and it became political when it should have been a political issue. As you said, it's a public health thing. But thank you for taking those questions. Thank you for those who submitted comments and questions, Dave. This has been fascinating.
And if anybody wants to, my Twitter is at Edge of Sports. I'll open up my DMs if folks want to ask me some questions.
Oh, thank you. That's amazing. Thank you so
No
much.
problem.
And once again, the book is The Kaepernick Effect. And we have plenty at Book Passage, San Francisco, Corte Madera. Feel free to come in safely to get your copy, or order online, or give us a call, and a bookseller, a very knowledgeable bookseller, will help you with that and many other selections. Dave, thanks for doing this. You're great.
Thank you. Like, I say one more thing.
Absolutely.
It's about getting beyond the pandemic. I was so excited to go from DC to San Fran, and because Book Passages is such an amazing reputation, and I'm a bookstore guy. Like, I'll travel to cities to check out bookstores.
Yay.
And I not only hope people support Book Passages, I want to say that I look forward to getting out there and supporting it myself, because we need the institution of the independent bookstore desperately in this country.
Yeah, yeah. We need people rallying around the independent bookstores, especially after the last year and a half. So yeah, we applaud your support. Thank you so much. And for those in the audience, also heed the call and support indie bookstores, indie and local.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, and continued success with the tour and getting the
Thank you.
message out.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for showing up.